Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 5 of the Equipped Collective podcast. If you're new around here, a special welcome to you, or if you've been tracking with us for a while, you know what, a special welcome to you as well, because you're just as special. There you go. So on this podcast, we talk about three main things, really. Theology, creativity, and culture. And whereas we're definitely not limited to those three areas, I believe that those three things are three really important areas, and what we have a real heart for is whether it is in our art, our creativity, our writing, our listening, our preaching, our whatever it might be, your day-to-day job, whether you're a plumber or a preacher or an electrician or an evangelist, whether you work in Sainsbury's or in a seminary or a charity shop or a chapel, our real heart is that wherever you are, God has called you to live set apart for Him, whether that's in what you create, whether that's in how you speak, and that as believers we're not just called to be bystanders of culture, we're not just called to merely observe and commentate, but we're actually called to be in the depths of it, being witnesses of light, being countercultural, not just observers. So we hope that comes across on these episodes, and they're a blessing to you wherever you are, wherever you work, whether you're a student, whether you are really old in a great way or really young. I hope it's a blessing to you. You can find us on all socials, just at Equipped Collective, or on Instagram and YouTube. I haven't figured out the TikTok thing yet. I don't think I'm young enough for that anymore, or cool enough, so we're sticking for Instagram and YouTube now. And obviously you can listen to our podcasts on Spotify and Apple Music. And that's enough waffling from me. Today's episode is titled Christ Wasn't Where I Thought He'd Be. So without further ado, here is episode 5 of the Equipped Collective podcast. If you were in the narrative of Scripture of when it was written, and someone was to come and ask you, 2,000 years ago, where can I find God? What type of place would He be in? What would your answer be? Because I was reflecting on this the other day, that a real theme I see in Scripture is that God is found in places that I don't think people would expect to find. Where do you think you would find Him? If you were in perhaps the book of Exodus in those times, and a Jewish person came up to you and said, "Oh, you know what? I'm a bit lost at the moment. I'm praying, but I don't really know where can I find this God?" Would your first answer be, "Yeah, actually, I just saw him in Burning Bush with an 80-year-old bloke who's got a stutter"? You wouldn't say that, would you? Because when I read the story of Moses, for example, you're confronted with two main things really here, aren't you? First of all, you're confronted with the great I am, the presence of God, that He is a all-consuming fire. But then you're confronted with the presence of the great I am not, if you will, in Moses, that his first response to God is, "Not me. I have a stutter. I have this," when God says, "Go to Egypt and say to Pharaoh to let my people go." So we see God from the Old Testament, from Genesis, and I'm aware there's so many examples we could pull from, and in Exodus, in places and using people that you never would expect that He would use. And I was kind of asking myself the other day, as I was thinking about this, of, well, why do I think that, not that God shouldn't be in those places, but why am I surprised that He's in those places? Why am I surprised that He's in places of brokenness, of darkness, of sin, of where messed up people are just lost in their own narrative? Why am I surprised that He's in those places? And I think I came to an answer, and I might even figure out more as I go along and record this episode. But I think I came across what my answer is, and that is because there's a part of me that I think God is like me. As in, if I was God, I probably wouldn't be hanging around those places. I think if I was God, I'd probably have my feet up in the heavens and, chilling out. And I came to realise that is a very sinful and poor way of thinking theologically about God. That I was defining, that I was not, perhaps not defining, but that I was seeing God through how I would be if I was God. And I realized how idolatrous and how bad of an attitude that actually is. And in one sense, it is a natural thing, I think, to be surprised to see a fully holy, fully loving God coming to dwell with his creation, because he doesn't have to. God's under no obligation to do anything. The psalmist tells us that the Lord does what he pleases. So there's no spiritual gun to God's head, if you will, to make us, to be with us, to come and dwell in any place. But I have to be honest with you, I think I've read passages of scripture where God is dwelling with sinful people before, and have subconsciously said, oh, I'd never do that. You know, like even me as a sinful person, I wouldn't go around, hang around with X, Y, Z, or I wouldn't be found there. So how can God be found there? And I came across this verse in Psalm chapter 50, and I'd recommend, if you've got time, go and read the whole psalm. Some staggering words in there, and God is speaking of his judgment to the wicked. And I want to read you a few words of what he says to the wicked in Psalm chapter 50, and start from verse 19 and listen to verse 21 especially. He says this: "You give your mouth free rein for evil, and your tongue frames deceit. You sit and speak against your brother. You slander your own mother's son. These things you have done, and I have been silent." And here's the bit that really kind of shook me to the core a little bit. God says this: "You thought that I was one like yourself, but now I rebuke you and lay the charge before you." Verse 21. You thought that I was one like yourself. So, and I came to realize that perhaps the reason why I sometimes really not struggle with the idea of God coming to dwell with me, but the fact that I would be a little bit, sometimes even like, are you sure you want to do that, God? Are you sure you want to come and dwell with me? Are you sure you want to forgive me? It's like I'm trying to convince him of what he should do, and then I kind of hear those words of, you thought I was one like yourself. It's as if he said to me, I'm nothing like you. You know, I don't need your help on who I give mercy to. And sometimes we can treat God's silence as God's agreement. And here's what he says in verse 21 is, these things you have done and I have been silent. You thought that I was one like yourself, but now I rebuke you and I laid the charge before you. So do we treat God's silence as his agreement of what we do? Because eventually believing that leads to us thinking perhaps that he must be like us. If I don't immediately hear within myself that's wrong, God must be alright with it, surely. And I've come to realise that isn't who he is. That God is nothing like me, so that when I find him in these unexpected places, which we're going to explore in a minute, that he isn't like me. And I wonder if that's true for you listening today, is perhaps you see God through the lens of, well, what would I do in this situation? And I'm not saying that you've ever said that out loud, because I often realise that I haven't ever said any of this stuff out loud to God, but I look at my attitude and I often think, well, that's kind of been mirrored in how I've lived. Not necessarily what I've said, but how I've lived. And I truly think that the biggest mistake that we can make as Christians is believing that God is like us. Because truthfully, he is nothing like us. He is more holy than we could ever perceive him to be. He's more loving than we could ever perceive him to be. But he is not anxious in the heavens. You know, the psalmist tells us that God neither slumbers nor sleeps. I believe it was Spurgeon who said that God allows us to sleep and to rest to remind us that we are not him. And in the Gospels we see that Jesus, who was God in the flesh, is found in some surprising places. And what we need to realise is that when we say God isn't like us, we have to acknowledge what happened in the incarnation. And the incarnation is just a fancy word for God putting on skin and bone, for him coming as a human, for him living a human life and being truly human, truly God. That when we say God isn't like us, that does not mean that Jesus doesn't know what it's like to be a human, because the writer of Hebrews tells us that he was tempted in every way, and that he's able to empathize with our weaknesses. That's the first half of the verse, that Jesus knows what it is to be tempted in every single way, so that in our weakness he can help us. And on a practical note, Jesus also knows what it is like to be a human, to suffer, to not just know suffering as a philosophical concept, but he knows what it is truly like, so that when we're praying, we're not talking to a distant deity in the clouds, but a God who has come to earth and got his own dirt that he made under his fingernails. This is who we're talking to. So Jesus is like us in the sense that he knows what it's like to be a human, but we need to remember the second part of that verse in Hebrews. He was tempted in every way, so that he may empathize with our weaknesses, yet he did not sin. So Jesus will never ever comfort us to sin. Jesus comforts us and empathizes with us so that we can leave our life of sin, not to sin more. And we have to acknowledge this, that yes, God is not like us, that he is holy, that he is set apart, that he is in his own right to do whatever he pleases. Yet in the same instance, in the incarnation, we see God coming as close as he could ever come, and knowing what it is truly like to live as a human. And me realizing in the Gospels that Jesus was in places that I didn't think I'd find him, led me to this. It led me to realize these things. It led me to know that truthfully my vision had been put through the wrong lens. You see, I thought I knew where I'd find Christ. My eyes assured me that they'd see him raising a glass with the world's righteous friends. But instead, I saw him knelt with the blind man on the street, saying, "Son of David, have mercy on me." I thought I'd see him signing autographs in the crowds, but instead I saw him crouched down, sweating in Gethsemane. And my heart convinced me that I'd find him burning down the city in rebellion, but instead out of the corner of my eye I saw him healing the ear of his enemy. And my crooked vision led me to believe that I'd only find him in places of abundance, the places where joy made life bloom. But instead I found him in the black and white world, weeping outside his own friend's tomb. I thought I knew where I'd find him. He seems to be much different in my way of thinking. You see, my mind told itself that I'd only find him overlooking still waters, but instead I found him in a storm with his own friend sinking. I was convinced I'd find him flicking through the files of my life, seeing me as someone to erase. But instead he found me and with hands that were pierced for me, gave me grace. Truthfully, I didn't think that he could be found. In my mind he sat removed in the clouds. And perhaps this was all a fairy tale. But I was quickly proven wrong when I saw him walking Golgotha's hill with scars on his back and dirt under his fingernails. And now I know there's not a room that he wouldn't sit with me in, because grace has taught me that there is not a square inch or a single blade of grass that doesn't belong to him. He was in places I'd never expect. And how can it be that the giver of life is found washing my feet and sustaining all things with his very breath? He seems to run after those he loves. He certainly wasn't put off by the sin within and darkness around me. And the more I think about it, I didn't find him at all. Perhaps, yes perhaps, he found me. Yes, the more I think about it, I didn't find him at all. Perhaps, yes perhaps, he found me.